Good day to you. You know, if you were an alien landing on this planet Earth and you went inside some human beings' homes, you may say to yourself, why do you have this thing on the wall there interrupting the beautiful color of the wall? Why is that electronic thing on the wall? And yet, that's what we human beings do. We put our televisions all over the house, even in our living rooms. Think of the name of that word, the name of that room, right? Our living room where we live. In that room, we organize our furniture around the television set. And even if that means putting the television in front of a window so that we can't see outside because that's the only place it fits in the room, we're willing to do it. That's how important television is. Even though today students are not watching as much television as past generations, they are streaming. And so what we are talking about today, I would like you to think of not necessarily as television, though that is mostly the focus of today's instructor video, but really about video in general, and that includes streaming. So we are taking on video today. We are taking on television, if you will. It's chapter 8. We're crossing over the midpoint in the course. And really, television has changed so much since it first came out. We've been hinting it when television came out in the 40s and 50s, but it's changed so much. For example, there was a newscaster named Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was the most respected person in all of the United States, more than presidents, more than school teachers, more than anybody else. A news anchor on television was the most respected person back in the 1960s. And that just speaks to how far TV has in a way fallen because of fake news and because of the splintering of the audience into many different outlets looking at television, and because of cable and satellite television changing what we expect from television, and because of the interactivity of the audience, which now means that the audience can interact with television. That was not the case when it first came out. All of these things have resulted since television was first developed. So now let's talk about the history of television. We're going to start with the invention of television itself. It was invented by a farmer in Utah by the name of Philo Farnsworth. Philo is how he spelled his name. He was a farmer and he used to sit on that tractor all day planting seeds. And he had this idea, what if I could replicate what I'm doing, going down one row, turning, coming back the other row, going down another row? What if I could replicate that kind of creation of lines electronically? Could I create an image that can be transmitted? And that's where he got the idea of broadcasting eventually, which is a term that comes from farming itself. When you're planting seeds, it's much more efficient to cast the seeds broadly, right? And hope that 3 out of 10 take in the soil versus putting an individual seed in a hole. Broadcasting is more efficient. That's where that term comes from. It comes from farming. And Philo Farnsworth is fitting in this kind of tradition. There was another inventor, though, who also claimed to have invented television. He was a Russian named Vladimir Zworykin. You can get the spelling of him in the chapter. He was a Russian immigrant. He had a Ph.D. in engineering. He also filed a patent for the so-called technology of television with RCA. Remember RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, is managing patents. We learned about that last class. But it was ruled that Philo Farnsworth got there first. So he gets the patent, he gets the recognition for inventing television. And so we have in 1939, we have some significant TV broadcasts using electronic equipment, the first one of which is NBC, the National Broadcasting Corporation, started in radio, moved over to television, covering the World's Fair. Now, we don't have world fairs anymore, but at the time, world fairs were supposed to showcase new technology, like a helium balloon, any kind of electronic devices that was featured at the World's Fair. So similar to radio, however, television also suffered a setback because in World War II, the government halted the manufacture of television sets so that the energies could be put into making munitions and other kinds of supplies for the war effort. And because of that, in the 1940s, most stations went off the air. And in fact, from 1948 to 1952, the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, the branch of government that regulates broadcasting, in those years, the FCC actually froze licensing television stations. So it wasn't even possible to start a television station in the 1940s in 1948 to 1952. Similar to how film reacted to television, also restaurateurs reacted to television the same way. They didn't like TV, people who own restaurants, because they thought that people would rush home to watch TV instead of hanging out in the restaurant and drinking and eating more and running up their bill. similar to film, right? Now let's start to talk about some of the early television shows. You can see the links for these. It's really old school television here. We've got Milton Berle. He was a variety entertainment performer. You could say that a Jimmy Fallon today or a Trevor Noah is sort of picking up in that tradition of what Milton Berle did, except things were a little bit different. He had the Texas Star Theater Show. The Texas Star Theater Show, and that was a show that showcased comedy and singing and variety, and Milton Berle, a comedian, was the host of that show. But it was called the Texas Star Theater because it was sponsored by Texaco, the oil company. And you can see when you look at the clip of that, you can see the Texas oil jingle being sung. At that time, whole television shows were sponsored by one sponsor. And that sponsor would just run throughout the show like Texas Star Theater. Another important person in the development of television in this era was Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan, he would introduce a lot of musical acts like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. We're seeing crossover here between rock music and radio and television, right? Media are developing very quickly now, very fast-paced to the acceleration of the invention of these technologies. Another show we want to talk about is I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy. It starred Lucille Ball, a redhead comedian, and that show was taking place in New York, and acting on the show was her husband, who was a Cuban. His name was Desi Arnaz, and therefore this show was the very first, portrayed the very first interracial marriage on television. That was a big deal in the 1950s. Similar to what happened with Thomas Edison and the United Artists, and when we talked about last time film moving to Hollywood, that's what Lucille Ball did with her Lucille Ball show. She took her show out to Hollywood, and they introduced some new features to television that were not present before, like the half-hour format. And that's why most shows today are a half-hour long. Lucille Ball brought that in. Also, their show, I Love Lucy, brought in the laugh track. You know, when you're watching a show and you feel like you're forced to laugh even though you're not meaning to, that's the laugh track that's doing that to you. Also, this show was filmed in front of a live studio audience as opposed to recorded with no audience. And so you had a greater feeling of interaction with people on that show. Also, this show used what's known as a 3-camera shot. That is using 3 cameras to shoot the people, which changes how people move on the set, how they're choreographed, etc. Also, this show was the first one that was syndicated. Syndicated. Syndicated, that means a show that ran live, and then afterwards, since it's recorded, it's distributed on other channels. It's syndicated to other places, just like you find on FX. You find shows that ran before, Nickelodeon that ran before. Those are syndicated shows today. The arrival of color comes well, the experimentation with color took place in 1954 with television, but it was still too expensive, and a lot of TV producers and TV stations held off on investing in that kind of equipment. By 1959, only 3 television shows actually had color. It was not until 1965, that's a long time, right? 11 years before you could find color on, quote, the big 3 networks. And the big 3 networks at that time were CBS, ABC, and NBC. Fox joins much later. Also, television was transformed by cable and satellite television. Now, when you're sitting watching your monitor, your flat screen, as you probably refer to it today, you don't really care where that TV content is coming from, even if you even consider it to be TV content. I mean, you may be totally unaware that it's being delivered by cable or by satellite or by television, etc. So some of these distinctions are really not that important, but we do need to state that cable and satellite opened up television because cable television was invented, here we go again, in Pennsylvania, in the mountains of Pittsburgh. It was invented because people who lived on the other side of the Allegheny Mountains couldn't pick up signals from downtown Pittsburgh, so TV stations started to run cables out to those people and get the signal to them that way, kind of going back to the telegraph, which used cable also. It was borrowing that idea in a way. And so that gives birth to cable television, the means of distributing it. At the same time, satellite television comes into play. Satellite technology it piggybacks onto cable technology. You've got a satellite provider, and those people are sending content up into the bird in the sky. That's the satellite, and then it bounces off that bird, and then it comes back down to a satellite receiver, and that's going to be your home. That's why you have to have satellite dishes pointing at a certain point in the horizon. Or the satellite signals are going to be received by a cable company and then redistributed on a cable network. That's what happens with HBO. It happens on Blue Ridge Communication, happens on Comcast, happens on Service Electric. Wherever you can find cable, you can find both of those two, satellite and cable, working together. Speaking of HBO, in 1975, HBO became the first channel to provide programming on satellite. And let's not forget what HBO stands for. It stands for Home Box Office, right? It's the idea of marketing this service so that it seems like you're bringing film into your house. HBO, that's what it was all about. Let's talk about one of the most important entrepreneurs in television now. His name is Ted Turner. At the age of 24, Ted Turner inherited a billboard company from his dad in Atlanta, Georgia. And through his work ethic and the wealth that he acquired, he then purchased a television channel there called Channel 17. He purchased that in 1970, and then he converted it to become WTBS. WTBS, ring a bell? Have you ever wondered why you have WTBS on your cable selection in Pennsylvania all the way from Atlanta, Georgia? It's because it is a super station. It's a super station because it's a broadcast station. It sends its content out to people in Atlanta over the airwaves, but then it also sends its content over cable to the entire nation. And there you have the basic model for how cable television became successful, is you have a local station that produces and then is able to send it out through the cable network. And that's what Ted Turner did. But he's most famous for inventing or developing CNN, the cable news network. At that time, there was no station that was offering just news all day long. And he came up with that in the 1980s. It was the first all news channel. And it actually made breaking news popular. Like when you watch Fox today and you see Fox News Alert or MSNBC with breaking news, that's where this is coming from. This comes from CNN, the idea of breaking news, or breaking into the regular programming and tell you what's happening now. But Ted Turner was not only just taking on CNN and developing HLN, by the way, which is also another property of his Headline News Network. Today it features feature programming. It's on your cable channel. But he also bought the MGM movie library. And so he has all these movies that he can air on his cable channels. And also he bought the Hanna-Barbera cartoon library, which includes the Flintstones, the Jetsons, and Scooby-Doo. So today you can find numerous cable channels, everything from BET to ESPN, the Weather Channel. It's all there for you. You've got premium channels, you have pay-per-view channels, but you also have, from cable companies, other services provided as well. Let's not ignore those. You've got, for example, audio services. You can listen to music on your cable channels. You've got the internet. I know I get internet from Blue Ridge Communication. You have security alarm systems, burglar alarm systems that are offered as well. All right, now let's go on to talk about digital television. So there used to be analog television, just like there used to be vinyl records. There still are vinyl records. They're both analog, right? But in 2009, the FCC shut down analog television and forced all television stations to go over to digital television. This then paved the way for HD TV as well, high definition television, which allows you to see a sharper image. You can look at people's freckles and wrinkles on HD TV, whereas the old TV boxes that were available in the 40s and 50s, no way. The screen resolution was very, very poor compared to what we have today. The very first digital broadcast was in 1998, and we have the Space Shuttle Discovery being broadcast when it launched in a digital format. I'd like to try and talk now about changes in the business structure of television. So first of all, we have the changes in networks and affiliates. So what an affiliate is it's a TV station, and you also have them in radio, which receive programming from a national studio. So you can have an ABC affiliate like WNEP, which is in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area, and that is a station that offers its own local programming during the day, but in the evening during prime time, what you have is programming that's coming down from the ABC studio. That's where you get all those popular sitcoms and other programs, dramas that are available on ABC. They're coming down from the studio. And so you have this relationship between networks and affiliates, and it used to be that the network paid the affiliate to carry the programming. And you might say to yourself, well, how does that work? The network is creating the programming and then it's paying a TV station to carry the programming. It's because along with the programming comes 8 to 12 minutes of advertising per half hour. And the network gets to claim something like 4 out of 5 of those advertising slots for itself and gives 1 slot to the local television station to sell for airtime. Whereas the network gets to claim those 7 minutes or 9 minutes or whatever, all that ad revenue that comes in, it goes to the network. That's why they pay the affiliates. But in recent years, that balance has changed somewhat, and affiliates are willing to pay for network programming. It's very, very important. Next up, in terms of restructuring the broadcasting industry, we have the Public Broadcasting Act in 1968. And this shook up the TV industry because it was a way of funding a new kind of television content through NPR, the National Public Radio, and through PBS, the Public Broadcasting System, which goes on television. And you've seen PBS programming. You probably were raised on Sesame Street at some point. Parents tend to look to Sesame Street to, do I say babysit or raise their kids when they're not around in some cases? And then kids move on over to MTV and then, or Disney. Disney comes next usually, and then MTV as they start to break away from parental control. But that's just one programming. There's other programming like National Geographic, or that might be on the Discovery Channel. What am I thinking of? Nova is another program that's a nature-based, science-based program. Masterpiece Theater. Over on NPR, you have Morning Edition, which is a news show, and in the evening you have All Things Considered. So public broadcasting does not have as big of a presence in the United States as it does in other countries, because our country is mostly made up of profitable media, money-making media. The last change to the structure of television was the Fox network, which was founded by an Australian named Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, born in Australia, he started a newspaper empire, including owning The Australian, the most important newspaper in Australia, and a bunch of local newspapers. Then he went into the British market. He bought The Sun, which is a very large circulating newspaper in Britain. He bought The Times, the London Times. He bought Sky B, which is a satellite television service. I mean, this is a big company. Remember, it's owned by the News Corporation. Do you remember that from an early class we had? Well, Murdoch got his sights set on the United States, so he came over here, lived here for 10 years, took up citizenship. You have to be a citizen on TV stations. And then he bought a bunch of TV stations and turned them into the Fox network, and you know how powerful that network is now. Let's talk about ratings now. We had ratings when we talked about film. We also have TV ratings, but in a different sense in television. Actually, 2 senses. The first sense that we have ratings is that's what the audience measurements are known as. They are known as Nielsen ratings, because that's the company that measures the audience, the Nielsen company. You've seen the Nielsen Top 10, right? That's what that's all about. The top 10 watch TV shows, or the top 10 watch TV stations, or the top 10 watch TV networks. That's the Nielsen company. They're collecting data from the audience. They're using what's known as a people meter. That's a little device that tracks people's television usage. You attach it to your television set. And they do what is known as 4 sweeps per year, 2-week periods where they measure audience data. That's what a sweep is. And then they provide that information to television stations for a price. You purchase Nielsen ratings. And the reason you purchase them is because then you go out to advertisers like car dealerships and you say, listen, we're the #1 television show in females 25 to 34. And so if you want to advertise for that audience, if you're looking, for example, at products that are beauty products, for example, aimed towards that demographic, you got to come with us, and we're also going to charge you the most because we have the biggest audience of that particular audience. It's more difficult, by the way, to track ratings in cable and satellite. All right, now let's go on to an earthquake in slow motion, as the book calls it. And what this is all about is in 1976, if you were to watch television, you would find the choices to be very few. I can remember sitting in front of that box, hitting the side of it to get a better picture, adjusting the bunny ears antennas to try and get a better picture, because there weren't many choices. There were basically the 3 networks and PBS. That was it. And at that time, those networks commanded an incredible share of the audience. Something like 80% of the American public would be watching those 3 networks. Well, they have lost all those millions of people because of the competition that's been provided by cable, and the competition that's been provided by satellite, and the competition that today is being provided by streaming services like Netflix, Amazon, Discovery, Disney, and the rest of them. Now let's talk about diversity on television. The picture is getting better, but it's still got a ways to go. So still on television, If you look at the United States population, at least going back 5 years, I'm not sure what the current figures are, but going back 5 years, in 2017, approximately 61% of the population is white in the United States. About 17.8% is Hispanic. About 13% is African American. 5.7% Asian. And then we have more than one race, which increasingly people are identifying as multiracial. We've got American Indian coming in at 1.3%, and we've got Pacific Islander coming in at 0.2%. So ideally, we would want to have TV content that reflects the proportion of those people on TV content too, but that has not been the case. TV shows, for a start, have been presenting people who are unrealistic representatives of the general population, not even talking about ethnicity. They tend to be better looking, they're in better shape, they tend to have happier lives, at least on television. They tend to solve problems much easier, at least on television. So we have that general distortion of reality that's going on television. But then we also have some whitewashing going on. We talked about that earlier. A famous actor named David Carradine. He was from a famous acting family, actually the Carradine family. He played a Chinese guy, even though he's white, in the series Kung Fu, a martial arts television series in the 70s. And when we see other minorities represented in television, it's not always in flattering roles. African Americans traditionally have been portrayed in crime-related roles or more subservient roles, not in terms of managers and in terms of household heads, stable household heads. The show that really broke that open was The Cosby Show. Bill Cosby, who later served time in jail for sexual exploitation. He's out now. He was acquitted. I believe he was acquitted. He's out now. But that show broke open the mold because it had a female black doctor on a show, a medical doctor on that show. And Bill Cosby was also a middle-class person. They were living in a middle-class house. Now let's go on to Hispanic and Spanish language television. We haven't done much to highlight Hispanic content so far in the course. We're going to do that now. We've got Univision, which is out of Miami. That's the most important Latin network in the United States. Latin Americans have also been underrepresented especially on the big four networks now. We're talking including Fox as well as CBS, ABC, and NBC. And then we've got Telemundo, which is in New York City, another Latin network. So we've got some really strong players. We're only going to see that increase, in my view, because Spanish language is increasing all over the U.S. We've also got the BET network. I want to make a mention of that, the Black Entertainment Network, founded by Robert Johnson. Really an interesting story. He was getting together with an investor. He had an idea for a channel that would just be for black people. And he wrote down his proposition on a napkin and handed it to the investor. And the investor's like, all right, the numbers look good. And now he's got this really successful cable channel, BET channel. It was actually started in 1980 in Washington, D.C. And it became very popular in part because car advertisers wanted to get to black people. You know, it's often about money in the mass media business. And so we see diversity being opened up, not necessarily because it was morally right, but because there's another audience out there to be made money off of. Let's broaden our discussion now to TV and society. There's a book called Tube of Plenty by Eric Barno. And he says that TV has had a revolutionary impact on society, even greater than the Gutenberg printing press. Why? Because first of all, it takes no skill to use television. You don't have to learn to read and write like you do books for the Gutenberg printing press products, right? You just push the on button on a TV and you can start watching it. Also, you can start using television from birth. From the moment a child is born, and many parents do that, they have them in front of the television, sometimes to help them go to sleep. And that makes it a revolutionary technology because it's so readily accessible. But also television has been criticized very often because it just gets people into unhealthy situations. I mean, for a start, when you're watching TV, you're usually starting out sitting and then you up lying down. And then you want a snack, and that goes on the coffee table, which wouldn't even exist probably if we didn't have television. It's put there into our lifestyle so that it can accommodate the watching of television. Now you're eating snacks, chips, soda, and stuff like that while you're lying down and not moving around. And so television has created a lot of problems. Also, television is said to be dumbing down people because it's trying to get the most people to view it. And so if you have big vocabulary words or intellectual thoughts or even offensive thoughts, in some ways you're going to have members of the audience, certain demographics, stopping watching, and you don't want that in television. The average television is on an American household for over 7 hours. Can you believe that? Doesn't mean that the same person is watching it for that time. It just means that it's on. And maybe there's people in this class, when they go to bed, they've got to have the TV on. All right, so how do people use TV? That's a question we want to ask. And one way is they use it to be entertained. We know that, to escape life, just like film, but also to learn new things and gain new information. Weather is a good example of that. Baseball scores is a good example of that. Learning about other countries through even shows like Survivor, that's another example of that. But then we also use television for sociality, to get together with others, to do something with others. Like film, television can be a medium where two people on a date, and especially if they're going to meet the father or the mother of one of the people involved in the relationship, you can watch television. It takes the pressure off of facing each other. You can kind of look at something that's over there and get to know each other in a gradual way. Now let's talk about how the standards for television have changed over time. In the 1950s and 60s, there were some really strict standards when it came to sexual implication. There was a famous comedy show called The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which starred two comedians, Mary Tyler Moore and Dick Van Dyke. They were both famous in their own right. When they were shown as a married couple in their home sleeping in their bedroom, they slept in separate beds because of how offensive it would be to put them in the same bed. Can you believe that? Back to Lucille Ball, the comedian Lucille Ball. She got pregnant when she was doing her show, but she wasn't allowed to use that term pregnant. It was seen as too vivid. She has to use the term expecting. She's expecting a child. In 1997, we get some standards that come out to regulate TV. This is another way to use ratings. I said there are two ways to use ratings in television. There's another one, TV ratings. And so we've got G, we've got PG, we've got TV-14, we've got TVMA. We've got S for sex, we've got V for violence, we've got L for crude language. I don't know why it's an L. It should be a C maybe. We've got D for adult language. Does that really help parents control whether their kids watch TV? I doubt it. And we do have a problem of decency on television, at least as some people consider it. I don't consider it a problem. I think that television should reflect the way that people speak in real life, but our law tends to try and protect people from the way that people speak in real life when they're speaking on television. A good example of that is the 2004 Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake halftime performance in the Super Bowl, where Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake arranged for him to pull down her top and expose her breasts. And that ended up in a lot of lawsuits against CBS. That was the network that was broadcasting the Super Bowl, and the FCC got involved, and they tried to fine all of the affiliate TV stations over $300,000 for doing that. It was hung up in courts forever. And it was all because television stations are not allowed to air indecent material. We're going to come back and discuss that in more detail when we get to law in this class. But for now, just know that it's a very confusing subject, almost impossible to determine what is obscene, especially in a pornography age that's so readily available on the internet. So now let's take a look at the future of television. Always hard to predict. The idea of television is not really the way that people are speaking today. It's really about streaming. It's about screens. In fact, in my field, when researchers are researching audience behaviors, they talk about first screen, second screen, third screen. The first screen is the one you wake up to and you're on the most. That's your phone. And your TV screen is going to maybe be your third screen after your laptop. I don't know, maybe it's your second screen, but that's really the way that we need to start talking about TV. We know that the future will probably involve people continuing to, quote, cut the cord, move away from cable. It's become so incredibly expensive, especially with these other services that it offers. And now that wireless is available, people can stream, but again, you've got to pay for a lot of wireless services, YouTube Premium and whatnot. They're all subscription services. And so that leaves us with a glimpse of the future of television, but it really remains to be seen how wireless, in my opinion, is going to impact the traditional legacy networks and cable and satellite even more. So I dare use the phrase, stay tuned.